Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of our research data webinars, or bite-sized research data webinars. My name is Sean Lacey. I'm the Research Integrity and Compliance Officer for the University. And today I'm joined again, as similar to last week, by Dr. Patrick Egan, our Research Data Management Librarian. Last week, Patrick gave us a great webinar on how to complete a research data management plan. And personally, what I found really good with it is he used his own PhD as the template, as an example, which from my point of view was great to kind of see that hands-on kind of practical experience. So thanks very much, Patrick, for sharing that. This week, Patrick's going to outline how to plan for research data retention. And without further ado, hand over to you, Patrick. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Sean. And I'd like to add about that as well, looking at the PhD example. It is available as a public DMP on the website that we'll be talking about a little bit later on as well. So I'll just hop in and get going with sharing the screen. Hopefully you guys can see this. Okay, so thank you all for coming. Great to have the feedback and have a few people to follow up with from last week. But just in case you need any contact information, you can contact me at patrick.egan@mtu.ie. And so I'm involved in research data management here in the library. And if you have any queries on your data or your project or any work that you're doing around data, just let me know. There's a link here as well, and the slides will be available later on, library.cit.ie, in the research data management section of the library website that has a rundown on how to manage your data. So that's an evolving subject. So I hope you guys can get some goodness out of that. Okay, so today I want to talk about research data retention, and it's something that will come up for researchers no matter what type of project you're involved in, from the humanities to the sciences these days. Most of the time we're dealing with data. And we're seeing across Ireland and Europe that management data is no longer saving it to your laptop or your email or your USB drive, but it's about making it explicit what you're going to do with the data from the outset and how you're going to follow through with that. So we're here in the library to look after that, help you with the work on the documentation, from compliance and policy through to practical support on how to write this information down, which repository to select and store your research data. So when you're developing, let's say, an ethics application in MTU or a research data management plan, for example, you need to consider different activities relating to your research data with the university's data retention policy. Unfortunately, it's not possible to prescribe specific periods of retention because all research projects will differ. But in MTU's research data retention guide that we recently developed, there's some suggestions in there to help you to plan and describe a research project and decide on what information you want to retain and what you can delete, with an emphasis then on suggested schedules along the way. So that's kind of a general introduction to it. In the previous webinar, as we said, we were looking at completing a data management plan. This part will also feed into data management plans, but it'll have a bit of reference to ethics applications too. So it goes across data retention across the university. It's focused on steps. It was focused on, last week on steps 1 to 2 of the Science Europe data management plan guidelines. And those guidelines I'll touch on a little bit in this webinar as well. Again, last week, I was using my PhD research at UCC as an example, but MTU has a subscription to DMP Online. And if you visit the link dmponline.dcc.ac.uk, I think it's in the chat there, click on sign in with your institutional credentials, and then you'll be brought into the MTU section where you'll have a lot of options there to think about working with your data, and a lot of guidance there as well. Big thing to remember with data management plans, obviously, is that it's a living document. A data management plan will be complete, I suppose, when you're finished and you're not looking at your research project anymore. But during the research process, you can save and update your data management plan as you go along. This webinar outlines why we need to think about data retention as part of the research process when planning. It'll distill documentation that comes from, let's say, policies that are in MTU, national policies, European policies, extract important aspects of those policies, to look at those guidelines that should be adhered to, but also how we can bring them into research itself. What information should be or must be retained, and what needs to be deleted, and there's an emphasis then, of course, on the suggested schedules for data retention. So one of the questions, I suppose, first off, we would ask is, what is data retention? In the company conventional context, it's the implementation of a policy to have data on a system or removed at a certain time, made it unavailable to general users. Policy then weighs competing sets of interests. For research data, it's a little bit simpler here. Generally, we're working on data ourselves. If we decide whether we're going to keep or delete data after the research project has been carried out. And if we know that from the start of our research project, we can tell, okay, what are the potential places that we're going to keep it, or where we're going to delete it altogether. Some of this data, again, might be personal, so we have a duty to look after that data correctly in adhering to all the different policies that are out there. The data might be needed in future, or it may not be useful after the project is finished, of course. Responsibility of the researcher then is to manage this data, and then statements concerning reasons for deleting or retaining data will inform all parties. So, for example, if you're filling out your consent forms or information sheets for participants in research itself. MTU's research data management policy then, you can see here, there is that data should be kept in a manner that is compliant with obligations, with requirements, and with protocols, essentially. These were set out then in the National Policy Statement for ensuring research integrity in Ireland, and I've broken that down. So basically, research data should be secure, accessible, and retained for a length of time as required. Results should be open, honest, transparent, and accurate, respecting confidentiality. Research may be discoverable to determine the relevance to any legal proceeding. And the National Framework on the Transition to an Open Research Environment underlines the importance of as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. And you hear this a lot in data management as we go through this webinar. Open access to research data should lead to greater integrity in the gathering, analysis, and presentation of data, as it may be open to scrutiny by peers globally. It could also facilitate reuse of data for further research. Data access then should consider data protection and intellectual property regulations as well. So plenty that we can do with data, but why data retention? So first of all, we need to comply with those policies that I shared earlier on, and agreements that have been made, let's say, with funders and different institutions. They insist that you have to plan your data. In particular, they want to see this in the ethics applications across the country and in data management plans, and we'll see that in the coming slides. This information could be useful, so we make sure that data is preserved long-term and easily accessible with well-defined licenses and conditions where we can, and in some cases we can't share long-term, so we have to think about how long can we share our data for. The other reason for data retention is then, if we follow fair principles for research, we're managing our research better, because fair principles enable us to really think about what's best about our data in the long term, instead of it being left aside after a publication comes out. The A in fair principles means accessible. That means data should be made accessible both for yourself at a later date and others who might want to review or continue your work. And in general, we can adopt the approach then of open as possible, close as necessary. So we make our data accessible for the greater good. On the other hand, then, if you can't make your data accessible, you need to explain why. A lot of the time in data management forums and ethics forums, well, explaining why then has become the norm for these different documents. And for some reason, you might not be able to make your data available. Have a look at the webinar from, I think it's a couple of months back, by Trace Ahern here in the library, on how to anonymize, pseudonymize, and de-identify your research data. And that, especially in there where she talks about the risk factors involved with publishing your data. So data retention in the Science Europe guidelines, and these are guidelines for research data management coming from Europe. They provide clear steps for helping us to think about the data retention. For example, a good a well-written statement or data management plan will clearly describe how data will be made discoverable and shared. It'll specify when data will be shared under what license as well. It'll include the names of the repository, the data catalog, or the registry where data will be shared. It includes information on how long the data will be retained and gives precision on its timely release. It clearly explains why data sharing is limited or not possible, and then who can access the data under what conditions. So, for example, if only members of certain communities or via a sharing agreement, you can imagine some of the complications in different research projects there. It explains what actions should be taken to overcome or minimize data sharing restrictions. So you can see that here at the very bottom, they're very interested in making sure that if data can be made available, let's make it available, and it is for the greater good. In the section 5b, then, the criteria in the research management plan for data sharing and long-term preservation should be that it provides details of what data collected or created will be preserved in the long term, clearly indicates for how long. For preservation, they provide clear steps, and they say that a well-written plan for research data provides details of what data collected will be preserved, and clearly indicates, again, for how long. It provides details of which versions will be retained or destroyed, and explains the rationale. It provides details of how the selection is made and what possible interest there will be for reuse. It provides details on how the data and other required technologies, such as copies of software, specific versions of that software, will be archived in the long term. So basically, you have to think about all aspects of how data can be saved, preserved, and then how it can be shared and how other people can actually use that data itself, because it's no good just chucking the data onto a repository and leaving it there without any description or without any software to use to work with it. It explains also how data will be managed in a sustainable way beyond the lifetime of a grant. So who is going to look after the data after the funding is gone? What are the costs? And then the last bit then is it provides the name of the archive or the trustworthy repository. In the arts and humanities, that would be the Digital Repository of Ireland in our case, and there are various other trustworthy repositories that are tried and tested and used by researchers across the board. So you're showing the way and basically leaving no stone unturned about your data in the process. A cursory glance into the MTU ethics forum, if you go down to number 14 on protecting confidentiality, they asked the question, how long will the data be stored and how long will it be archived, if it's going to be archived? Explain if the data to be stored is made available for future researchers. So again, we're going back to that again. We want to know what's going to be done with the data at the end, how is it going to be looked after, and is it going to be retained at all? And that's not just for, let's say, all of the data that you might collect. It might be a subsection of the data. It could be split out into different sections. So there could be parts of data that are available and other parts that are not. So then, in a practical way, how can we think about why we might retain the data? Well, some of the reasons are, number one, it's in, it's mandate that comes in there, and we have to comply with mandates that are there. But there's also reproducibility, right, and further analysis as well. So if someone else was doing research on the same topic using the same data, and they had a different perspective on it, they could use the data that's there, and then they can further analyze the work that's been there. Reputation building then for your own work and colleagues as well shows that you're transparent about the work you have, and that you can build upon your reputation as a person who looks after the resources that you have. You haven't got it on your email, you haven't got it on a USB drive if people want to reuse the data that you have. For reference then, and look up in a community data set, talked about earlier on, it's really helpful for, let's say, data that are being collected on a specific topic and specific findings that other people can use to look up some of those, that raw data that's there. It's very helpful for that. Learning and teaching, again, goes without saying, if you've got a resource that's there, people can reuse that and they can do a lot of work promoting it. And again, that goes back to your reputation building. Avoiding duplication of data collection as well. We don't want to have the same work being done with the same people all the time. We can avoid that by making sure that we've got robust data sets that have been well described, and they can be reused by other people. Retention then also provides protection against misconduct. Obviously, if you're transparent about your work, it's there, and people can see the work and they can go back and look at the findings. IP theft, then the demonstrated work that you have done can be timestamped. Versions of it can be timestamped as well. And if anyone wants to go back and look at who came up with the findings for the work you've done, you can see it through all the data that's there. So it makes it much easier then for people to track back through the breadcrumbs of research. In lawsuits, if it ever did come to it, all the procedures again are accounted for. You've crossed everything off. You've made sure that you've looked after every aspect of your research. So on the MTU website, there's lots of resources there. One of them you can see here in the research data retention section. You can see there's a link to their data retention guide that we've developed, and I'll have a look at that at the end. It's an important consideration for your data management plans, of course, and a lot of this section does relate to writing data management plans, but it will also cover some of the suggestions that are needed for when you're developing your ethics application as well. At the bottom of the page, then it kind of veers further into the digital curation center. And if you look at the link at the bottom of the page, that gives some guidance on how to decide what data to keep. And that's something that can be difficult to do first out if you have no guidelines on how you're going to keep your data or delete it. And what are the different reasons for doing that? On the left-hand side here, you might ask yourself a question, for example, how valuable is the data? Does it have value for what it is? And then you have to weigh that up against, of course, the costs for keeping it as well. So if you're paying for it kept on, a certain amount of gigabytes on, let's say, a server somewhere, that's going to cost you a certain amount of money. Maintaining will also be a problem there. So what are the costs for keeping it, and does that equal or balance with the value of the data itself? Are there funder, institutional, or legal compliance issues? So have any of these institutions or funders or bodies, have they specified that you must keep your data for a certain amount of time? I know for sure that's true for the IRC, the SFI, other places in Ireland that you must keep your data for a certain amount of time. So they need to be checked when you're thinking about retaining your data. Publicly available, or will it be restricted access? Of course, you can, in some cases you could have restricted access, but you could still keep data about that, your data itself. So if your data was restricted, you could keep metadata that describes that information as well. So it's not just the data itself. Is it good enough in quality to reuse? So have you worked on it in a way that's processed in a way that's good enough quality so that others can reuse it? Would they find it useful? So will researchers be waiting for this data to come out, or funders expect it to be useful? In some cases, it will be significant data, so you want to make sure that you can process it in a way that it'll be good quality. Could it be easily integrated then with other vocabularies? So in some cases, you might be able to match it up with other vocabularies. You never know when you make your data available who it might be interesting for. And then what is its appeal? You might know directly what the appeal is in your area of research, but there might actually be other areas outside of your area of research where people might find it useful. What's the difficulty then in replicating? What are the barriers to future use? So some of these reasons for why you should retain data or why you must retain it. So you have to think about those, weigh up those ideas, and then ask yourself, how long would it be useful for to other researchers in the future? Data retention guide at MTU, which was recently developed, really tries to pin down the amount of time it might take to hold on to data and have it useful to other scholars and researchers. It's not something that's done usually in universities because it's difficult to tell exactly how long it will take. Every project is different. Everyone has their own, say, reasons for keeping your data for a certain amount of time. Every project is different depending on the research participants, depending on the research methods, and then depending on the research contexts. One example here is there's an EEC directive from 2001 that talks about medical procedures. And of course, that says that data should be held for 15 years after the completion of a trial. So you can see here on the top right-hand side. Obviously, that's a rule that's there. That's what they use, and that's what happens in that area of research. Clinical and controlled trials, they have their own set of time frames. And then we also have in the top middle here, you can see interviews. Let's say your average interviews in ethnography in the humanities, for example, it would be within 7 years of data collection or no longer than necessary. In other institutions, I know it could be 8 years. It just really depends on how valuable the data might be and all the different factors that I just talked about earlier on. The data retention, then, it would also depend on the research context. So what if there's a potential to cause anxiety in some research? You wouldn't really want to hold on to that information for longer than necessary. So what is longer than necessary? Is that at the end of the research project? Is that like 2 years after it or not? No longer than necessary is often what they default to. So you can see here on the right-hand side, in vulnerable groups, they're looking at within 7 years of data collection or no longer than necessary. Okay, so these are just guides. They're not rules. They're just guides to try and help you to think about what you might actually write yourself when it comes to it. Okay, so recapping on that then, really what we're talking about here is that you should be only planning for as long as is needed for research purposes. And those research purposes are your research purposes or research purposes of future scholars who might be working with your data. Consider all the different, let's say, issues, or think about the value of your data. Think about compliances that need to be done. Think about who's going to be accessing, quality of the data as you have processed it, significance, its integration with other data sets, the appeal of the data itself, the difficulty maybe in replicating it, having to describe it as well, barriers then to reuse that are there. Consider, most of all, the FAIR principles, and especially the accessible side of FAIR principles. Try and keep your data as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Okay, so there's a lot of information in there, and hopefully I've distilled it down to a point where you can get enough of a bite-sized understanding of it. I can give you more information and support on this if you contact me at patrick.egan@mtu.ie. We get a lot of queries from people asking about either data management plans, ethics, applications. There's a lot of different types of queries that come in on that. And we've developed the website in a way that we can kind of showcase a lot of the work that we do. So if you have a look at library.cit.ie and the rest of that link at the bottom there, you'll be able to see what you can get from that. Okay, so that's it for today's one, and I'll take any questions that you might have.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Patrick. Very useful and so informative. So if there's any questions, you can unmute to ask the question or just pop it into the chat. Maybe just to kind of, just while maybe someone might be thinking of a question to ask there, just going back to the guideline documents, like, so that but I suppose ultimately what I thought was quite useful with it is how you've mapped it to kind of that screening checklist that we'd use in the research ethics application forms, because throughout your talk you often mention research ethics, and there's such a strong relationship between research ethics and the data retention. So it seems very useful that you've used kind of the same format. But what I really liked with it is that you've references to each one of those kind of indicative timelines that you're giving. So I just found that very useful and just, again, practical, which similar to the talk last week that you gave. When you think of the overall motivation to doing these bite-sized webinars, it's the how to. and like it's very much kind of evident here. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah, I'd say, what's interesting there is that the data retention, if you have started that with your data management plan at the start of your research, that will feed into the ethics when it comes to the ethics itself. So it's a good idea to have the data management plan and all of those ideas around data retention kind of in your head, written down, and then you can just use them in the ethics application as a way to show how you're going to retain or not when it comes to it. So you've already kind of got that sorted out. So it's not extra paperwork. It's not loads more work to do. It's actually helping you to streamline the research process as you go along.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's mad. I think I was popping a few different links into the chat there. And it's just, I mean, it's only when I see them all together that it's quite evident, the amount of work that's been done by the library here in this area of the research data management. So thanks very much, Patrick, for taking the lead on this. Look, these bite-sized webinars are supposed to be kind of short, sweet, and very pointed to kind of a task. I think, Patrick, you've done that perfectly today. And if there's no questions, then we won't look to kind of keep anyone's beyond what they need. So if there's no questions, what I will do is I'll just put up where we're going next. So thanks very much again, Patrick. So that's the second of our 3 webinars that we've planned. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a final one for this semester, which is focusing on how to handle copyright and Creative Commons licensing. And Dr. Patrick Egan will be joined by Sinead Hanrahan for this webinar, and Sinead being our digital scholarship librarian. So hopefully we'll see you for that in 2 weeks' time, everyone. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Sean.